Good morning, everybody. My name is Clíona Riordán, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the Keough-Naughton Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. This symposium is taking place today as part of the Yeats initiative at the University of Notre Dame. It was a decision that Notre Dame came to because they recognized that Yeats should be a focal point in teaching and research in Notre Dame. And as well as having these scholarly events, the university also hosts postdoctoral scholarships. At the moment, we have a postdoctoral scholar working on the figure of the trickster in the 19th century. And this was a recognition, I think, of what Yeats did when he sponsored and supported young writers throughout his career. This event is the second event of the year. Earlier on, we had in London, at the Notre Dame campus in London, a conversation between Yeats's biographer, Roy Foster, and Fintan O'Toole. And so today, what we are doing is we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Yeats's Nobel Prize. And we are celebrating the fact that a dinner was held in his honor in this institution, in the Stephen's Green Club, on the 16th of January, 1924. And this evening, we're hoping to recreate the dinner in a contemporary fashion, which leaves a lot of wriggle way. So the dinner will be recreated, and we can honor Yeats in that way as well. W.B. Yeats came to Notre Dame twice, once in 1904 and in 1933, and his memory endures. A dear colleague, Tom O'Grady, wrote an article recently for the Notre Dame News highlighting the importance of Yeats's visit to the institution. And the library at Notre Dame has an extensive collection of Yeats' first editions, and it is a wonderful place for scholars to work. I want to thank the Stephen's Green Club for hosting this event. I also want to thank Pauline McNamara and Pádraig Dempsey, who have been so diligent behind the scenes in putting all of this together. And I want to acknowledge the organizers, Professor Chris Morash and Dr. Julian Dean, for bringing this initiative together. And I think when you look at the program, you'll agree with me that this is going to be a wonderful day of conversation, chat, and intellectual stimulation. So enjoy. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, that's loud. I'm Julian Dean, and I just want to take a brief moment to welcome you all here, and thank you for being here. This is going to be an enriching and I think very august occasion, too. Before I introduce our first panel, I just want to say a couple words. I want to echo Clíona's words of thanks to our host, the Stephen's Green Club, to the K&I, and especially to Pádraig and Pauline. Pauline, thank you so much. None of this is possible without you. Also, thanks to my partner in crime, Chris, whose all the good ideas today were his, all the bad ideas were mine. I will take that, that's fine. Now let's start the show. So what we were thinking when we organized this was that we would have each panel around an idea of Yeats, a certain aspect of Yeats. And so this first panel is around the idea of Yeats's voice. So Yeats, of course, is primarily known in his lifetime and in ours even as a lyric poet. So the voice is very important to understanding Yeats's work. Whether we think about the BBC recordings and the very nasally reading of Lake Isle of Innisfree, or the poems themselves, getting to the core of his voice and how that voice echoes into our time is what we're hoping to accomplish today. So let me introduce our panel. I'm joined today by Mayliss Besserie and Clíona Riordán, who are going to talk primarily, I think, about Mayliss's book, Scattered Love, which came out in June with Lilliput Press. It explores Yeats's afterlife, sort of the ghostly presence of Yeats as people in France try to explore their own relationship to the past and to lost loved ones and literally remains, that which remains. So Mayliss's first novel, Yell Sam if you still can, which is a brilliant exploration of Beckett in one of the most Beckettian of settings, the retirement home, is also a fantastic read. And she's got a new one coming out in June, is that correct?
Yeah, in May, yeah.
Fantastic. So this will be the third part of the trilogy, as I understand
yes,
it?
Yes, it's called Francis Bacon's Nanny.
So keep your eyes peeled for that. And then Clíona, on my far right, is the Thomas J. and Kathleen O'Donnell Chair in Irish Language and Literature, the Department of Irish Language and Literature, the University of Notre Dame. Clíona is a critic and translator. She holds a doctorate from the University of Lyon Lumiere, postgraduate degrees from the Sorbonne Nouvelle, and University College Cork, and an undergraduate degree from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick. Before joining Notre Dame, she taught Irish literature and translation at the Sorbonne Nouvelle from 2003 to 2023. Now, if you ask me, this is perhaps the biggest coup in academic history, to get Clíona to leave Notre Dame for Notre Dame, right? So I don't know how we pulled it off, but I am so pleased that we did. I'm so pleased that you were both here with us today. So if you would, help me in welcoming Clíona and Mayliss.
Thank you, Julian. So, Mayliss, perhaps you could tell us, first of all, where the idea for the Irish trilogy came about, and then we could move on to Yeats in particular.
Of course. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure, especially in this beautiful building in front of Stephen's Green. So I wrote an Irish trilogy related to the personal relationship I had to Ireland, because I'm going to Ireland since my childhood, and I like very much the Irish literature. I was very interested in a language, and writing about Ireland was a way for me to find my voice in French, because I tried to do something else than the regular writing in French, and thinking about what would be the language, what would be the writing in another language, helped me to have a little journey from one language to another, to write in a different way in my own language. So I began with this first book about the last days of Sam Beckett in his nursing home, and when I found that he ended his days in this place which were, more Beckettian than you could even imagine. I went to visit the place, and there was a kind of possibility to imagine a way to tell the story, which would be between the two countries and the two languages, because I had this feeling that probably the English, which was always there, but became more and more important in the last days, because he translated himself at the end of his days, and it's the last words he wrote in the nursing home. So we kind of needed to have the Irishness of Sam Beckett to understand part of the life and part of the writing too. Because no matter how much he said about Ireland, he was part of this tradition too, no matter how much distance he took with it. So it was about bringing this Irishness to Beckett, to a French audience.
And what about Yeats? Because that poses a different question for a French audience, doesn't it? A different challenge, in a sense.
He was quite the opposite in a way, because Yeats died in France, as you know, in Roquebrune-Cap-Martin, but in appearance he wasn't that related to France, but reading the biography, that through Maud Gonne and through a lot of things, he was related to France, but he wasn't a French speaker, so this was a main difference. And I found out that in France he wasn't famous at all, he wasn't read, for many reasons. The first reason is, I think it's because it's poetry, and poetry is always a challenge for translation. And I think that it has been translated mostly by poets. So
Yves Bonnefoy, for
Yves
example.
Bonnefoy, for example, the kind of old translations and very creative translation, I would say, quite far from what it was. And if you don't have the political background and the cultural background of what experienced Ireland in those times and the independence and all that, it's quite a challenge as a French reader to understand this writing, you know. So maybe that's one or two of the reasons why, but it's quite a shame that the French audience don't know anything about Yeats. They all say Yeats first, and I found that maybe it would be nice to tell the story in my way, because I'm not Irish, and I know, so I just wanted to find a way to tell the story and to make them feel and experience the feeling I had as a reader of W.B. Yeats.
And what was the element that precipitated the story? What was the hook, in a sense, that got you interested?
Well, it's the same, it's always a coffin. There was this wonderful article in 2015 on the Irish Times telling the whole story about the coffin and what's in the coffin, and everyone knows this story here today, so I'm not going to tell you the story, but there were the letters in French from the diplomats, trying to understand what happened to the body, and those letters were handwritten, quite difficult to read and to understand, and so they were all published in the Irish Times, and I was like, it's very weird that no Irish writer wrote about that, because it's just such a wonderful material, not even everything, the names of the people, Monsieur Keough, Mr. Stone, he was the real name of the guy, and everything was fiction, and they were trying to understand what happened to the body, but the way they investigate, the way they mentioned every detail was completely crazy. And so I was thinking, everything which is real seems fictional. So, and I think it's just because it was in French and badly written, handwritten, that nobody could really use it as a creative material. So I took a chance of using them and try to, because it's only first material, you need to turn it into a story. So my idea was that I'm from a French point of view, being on the French point of view, saying, okay, there is a poet who died in France and has been, for some reasons, transferred to a common grave. And on the French point of view, nobody knew who was W.B. Yeats at the time in that specific village, and so everybody was kind of shocked that their homes, or maybe part of their homes, has been used to fill a coffin of a poet they've never heard of. So I kind of invented a group of people who have family in this common grave, and who are quite shocked that it's been used to transfer the body or something in the remains in Ireland for national funeral. So this is a kind of very Irish story, like very dark humor, because it's tragic in a way, but at the same time it's completely crazy, because every detail of the story is crazy. But what I liked was the possibility of talking about posterity and eternity, because W.B. Yeats is always quoted in American president speeches, and he has such such a powerful poetry, and still for all the world who speaks English, that I thought that it would be a good way to speak about death and eternity, and that his poetry survived to everything. So he was bright and important enough to be able to face this question of death and what happened to the bodies.
So there's a double exploration, in a sense. There is mediating Yeats' story and telling it to the French people. and then exploring the question of what happens to dead bodies and the homage we pay to remains.
Yeah, and it's a bit the same question as writing. You know, writing is very material and metaphysical at the same time, and it's the same time for death in a way. You know, like there is so much questions about what happened to the body, and I mean the title is "Love Scattered" because nobody liked the idea of a body being scattered except if it's ashes and if it was the choice.
Deliberate,
but everybody knows that he wanted to be buried under Ben Balban, and it's not what happened. And this and like history happened, and war, and so this was just the idea of the body is very is a nonsense in a way because everything disappears at a certain point. But it's also a very important question to everybody who lose someone. So it's a universal question. It's a universal question, and it's an absurd question. So it's a perfect topic for writing, in a way.
But how did you manage? Because, in a sense, when you were writing for the French writers, you had to tell them both the story of Yeats and the story of Ireland at the same time. In terms of the technique that you used, did you have a timeline for Yeats? Did you plot what you wanted to include? How did you go about it?
Well, my idea was to bring back a ghost. It was just easier for me because I could use two temporalities. So there is this investigation of French people trying to understand what happened to the dead of the common graves. So that's the first level of the story, and it's a way for the French audience to approach this question of Yeats. And they know nothing, so they learn from scratch who's W.B. Yeats, and that he was a Nobel Prize, that he was a senator, he was a father of independence, that he became a national treasure in Ireland, that he became, like one of the most important poets in the English language and all that. But they learn that from scratch. And this is the level of investigation. And there's a second voice. So there's one chapter in each language, in each voices, The other voice is the voice of a ghost called William. And this ghost is a kind of supernatural creature who's telling his own story in a kind of old-fashioned poetic way. And he's a way to experience not Yeats, but a Yeatsian voice. I had to find a kind of equivalence in French. What would be it's not something scholar. It's like what would fill an audience of Yeats' kind of writing in French. So you had to find an equivalence. That's very difficult because it's very different languages. But I had to think between 19th and 20th century. It's not Victor Hugo. It's not. It's romantic. Then it becomes very different to romanticism. So you had to find something that would make you experience a kind of Yeatsian way of feeling poetry and language. So this was the creative part, but my trick is that it's a ghost, so it's not really Yeats. So it's a kind of voice. It's like playing an instrument with, everybody plays the same music, but you're just a small instrument playing in the same vibration. So I didn't pretend to write like Yeats. I just wanted to pay a tribute and to make the French reader feel something which is inside the Yeatsian word. So it was just my point of view, of course, and transfer to French language.
Perhaps the easiest thing for people to get an idea of what you were about is for us to read a little extract. We'll read it bilingually. Mayliss will read in French and I'll read the translation. So can you situate this extract?
Yes, so that's, I would say, the second or third time that William is starting to speak as a ghost. And so people is investigating and learning more and more about what happened when he died and what happened to hide the body and what happened in his life. They are reading things about his life, and they planning to go to Ireland to ask for a DNA analysis of the remains because they really want to bury their own ones. And at the same time, we have this spirit of William telling the reader another story. My dear Maud, tourment de ma vie. Apparu le 30 janvier 1889, jour béni, jour maudit, dans ton cabriolet tiré par un puissant coureur au sabot noir. Tu volais, ma corneille, sur les méchants pavés de Londres, secouée dans ta cage de cuir de Belgravia à Bedford Park. Arrêtez-vous, chauffeur, leur maison est ici. Ta terrible beauté t'a suivi, rose fière de 22 ans, rose de tous mes jours, jusqu'à notre demeure. J'ai vu marcher la déesse, la mère du peuple des fées, la grande reine. Je l'ai vue passer le mur des briques et caresser les tournesols. J'ai senti le parfum de son Irlande emporter mon âme au-delà de l'horizon, au-delà de la mer, la verser dans les lacs et les rivières du Cid, au bord des îles merveilleuses battues par des vents désolés. J'étais apprenti poète, caché par le père, caché par le peintre John, dont l'étoile azur couverte de satire se couchait sur mes rêves juvéniles. Quand l'auguste silhouette de 6 pieds de haut, la souveraine soufflée de boucles bronze, a frappé, j'ai ouvert.
My dear Maud, my life's torment. You appeared on 30th of January 1889, a blessed day, a cursed day in your cabriolet, drawn by a mighty black-hoofed horse. You flew my crow over the mean cobbles of London, shaken in your leather cage from Belgravia to Bedford Park. Stop, driver, their home is here. Your terrible beauty followed you, proud Rose of 22, Rose of all my days to our home. I saw the goddess walk, the mother of the fairy people, the great queen. I saw her walk past the brick wall and caress the sunflowers. I felt the perfume of her Ireland carry my soul beyond the horizon, beyond the sea, pouring it into the lakes and rivers of the Shee, on the shores of the marvellous islands racked by desolate winds. I was a poet's apprentice, hidden in the shade of my father, hidden in the shade of the painter John, whose azure canvases, bedecked with satyrs, covered my youthful dreams. When the august 6-foot-tall figure, the sovereign queen, with her bronze curls knocked, I opened.
Elle est entrée comme une ombre. Elle a glissé et s'est fichée dans mon œil, entre mes paupières que la poussière a refermées. Comme l'eau dans le bois, Maud s'est insinuée. Divine, une goutte pour chacune de mes pensées. Lionne majestueuse, elle s'est engoncée dans la maison, le visage fendu par la lumière de Londres. Maud est arrivée les mains pleines. De vœux de guerre contre la couronne, de vœux pour l'Irlande. Elle a piqué mon père de ses mots guerriers, l'a touché en plein cœur. Il voyait déjà les combats, les balles de fusil, les morsures engendrées par les crocs de sangliers sortant de la gueule d'aspics venimeux. Il imaginait les bouches assoiffées, les corps vidés de sang, tombés de sommeil, enflés à en mourir. Moi, j'avais sous les yeux la reine Mève en personne, les poignets entourés d'or et de pierres, prête à lancer la bataille de son cri perçant, à crier à la guerre et à écouter, du haut de son char, le choc lointain des épées et des haches. Je sentais le souffle de la combattante, de la reine d'Irlande, m'enivrer comme un vent d'espérance, comme un vin de seigneur.
She entered the house like a shadow. She glided in and glued herself into my eye between my eyelids, which the dust had shut. Like water in the wood, Maud slipped inside. She was like a divine elixir, one drop for each of my thoughts. She strode into the house like a majestic lioness, her face split by the cold London light. Maud came with her hands full, with oaths of war against the crown, with oaths for Ireland. She stung my father with her warlike words, touched him to the core. He could already see the fighting, the bullets from the rifles, the bites from the fangs of boars coming out of the mouths of poisonous asps. He imagined the thirsty mouths, the bodies drained of blood, falling asleep, swollen with death. I had Queen Maeve herself before my eyes, her wrists encircled with gold and precious stones, ready to start the battle with her piercing cry, ready to clamour for war and ready to listen atop her chariot to the distant clashing of swords and axes. I could feel the breath of the warrior, the Queen of Ireland, and it intoxicated me with the wind of hope like noble wine. I think we can see there that there's an intensity in that voice, and you give this voice in short bursts throughout the book. What's the other voice?
The idea that it was just to have a kind of taste of a feeling what Yeats' word is. And the investigation is a very, I would say, today voice. So my challenge was that I decided that at some point of the book there would be only one voice. And I had these two completely different voices, and so I thought that the only way to make it one is that I've decided that when they go to see the whole team investigating, the French team would arrive to Sligo and to Drumcliff, and when they see the grave in Ireland, that there would be only one voice after that, meeting with the grave. And so my idea was to contaminate, if I can use that word, contaminate slowly the investigation voice by the rhythm of the Williams voice. So I had a kind of, without changing the kind of vocabulary at the investigation, I kind of just used slowly the same rhythm. And the rhythm I gave to the William chapters was so strong in my head that when I was writing the book, I wasn't able to read anything because it wasn't the rhythm I decided. So I had this rhythm very, very clear in my head. So slowly, I just decided to write it with the same rhythm, and the rhythm make the two voices mixing, and by chance we don't notice too much that one voice is disappearing because it becomes just one voice which is included all what happens in Yeats's word. I mean, this experience was for me that from a French point of view, as soon as they take the plane and go to Ireland, everything becomes a bit different. Everything is a bit magical. Even in the plane, things becomes a bit strange. And they have a kind of experience of what Ireland is, not only the country, but, I mean, the landscape, the people, the Celtic word behind, and the cultural word behind, and all this tradition of literature. And so it's a kind of initiatic experience for them, trying to understand what death means and how you can deal with the burden of having dead people in your own family, and sometimes a secret behind, and you have to live with that heritage of people who died before you and who are buried somewhere, and sometimes you don't know what happened, and you live with all this history. So when they arrive in Ireland, they have this kind of mystical experience, and this voice becomes a great help to give a specific rhythm and to put the reader in a kind of hypnotic experience of, as if it was a mantra, this rhythm is all going over and over and over. And no matter if the words are not the same, you have the same feeling because you get used to that rhythm as if you were in a kind of train,
Or in a kind of a trance. That's what you want to do.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so how did you write it? Did you write the Yeats voice all in one go, the William voice all in one go, and then cut it up? Or did you write it in alternative chapters from the very beginning?
No, I wrote in an alternative chapter in the beginning, since the beginning, because I just needed to build it slowly, and first it's very different, and slowly it becomes a kind of small adjustment between the chapters, and it's reducing. So the challenge was only on me. I don't think it's something for the reader. And the big challenge was to turn this French Yeats voice that I created into English again, and the challenge was on you, poor Clíona, to bring back to English and to try to keep something from this strange voice.
When there was the event at the beginning of the week, the conversation between Roy Foster and Fintan O'Toole, one of the audience members asked Roy Foster how he could, his advice for young writers. And he said the advice was to read the texts again and again so that you could hear the voices in your head. At the end of writing this, you must have been almost in communion with Yeats daily.
Yes, it happens every time you write on a writer, I think. I remember with Beckett having this feeling that sometimes the way I'm doing my research is like I do a kind of general research, and then I'm looking at specific details when I need them, because I don't want to be completely drawn in a huge research, and I don't want to do any work that would be theoretical, because I want to do a creative work. They are novels, so I need to have a kind of deep feeling, and to keep that feeling, and not to be too much into details that would be analysis of the pieces and the writing and all that. So that's the way I work. And sometimes there were things that I didn't know yet that I started to write about, because it was just logical on the journey of the character. You start to know well, and some things that I found out that some things happened and that I already thought about before, because I was so used to the kind of character I was working on, that you kind of understand in a strange way.
And do you go on I know that when you were doing the Samuel Beckett book, that you went to the nursing home, to Le Terreton. Did you have a similar journey with the Yeats book?
I went to the Terreton, went to 40 Foot, I went to Fox Rock, and all the places that Samuel Beckett had been. And in the two countries, not everywhere in the world that he went. And yes, of course, I went to Sligo, and this was inspiring. It's the same. I wasn't looking for truth. I was looking for. I just needed to feel, to have this journey, and especially I took a morning train on a Sunday morning to go to Sligo, and to have, on the way to go, you have all the names coming in Irish, all the station, and in the landscape is so different. And when I arrived, it was a kind of lashing outside. It was very empty, and it was such a challenge to find a way to go to the cemetery, and everything became an adventure. And this is also something you can add in the book. As you have found the voices, you can add things that you really experience in real life, because it happens here, and as a foreign person you of course have a different eye on things around, and at the same time when you have in mind what you wrote about this beautiful landscape and this beautiful mountain and this, you have this in mind, and you have your own feeling added to that. So it's kind of your creativity can work on its own creativity, and it's just a kind of long dialogue you have with the writer you pay a tribute to. And I think in the way, no matter if you really decide to write on someone who did exist, or if your project is, or you think your project is to create something completely new, but it's still the same. You're also the product of everything you read in your life, and all the beautiful writing you loved, and writers are readers, and so you're full of the words you really loved, and poetry and plays and novels. So no matter you really say, oh, here I'm writing on that man because I admired him too much, and he just changed the way are starting to see the word, or you don't say, you always do something like that, having a long dialogue with the writers you loved.
I suppose my final question is, you say, I'm a foreign person. Do you think it was only possible to write about Yeats in the way you did because you were French? Because that you're coming at Yeats from a remove, in a sense. You're standing away from him, because I think the weight of Yeats in Ireland is so great. I'm not sure that any Irish writer would have the chutzpah to undertake a similar project.
Probably. And at the same time, I needed to have some background on Ireland to understand Yeats and the way people love him here. There is something which is very emotional too about Yeats. Then the way people in Ireland love Yeats is very different to the way Americans have respect to his work. It's very different. So you need to have one foot in the country too to understand. But yes, of course. But I would say for Beckett, it was quite the opposite. It was worse on the French side to dare to write on Beckett and giving him a voice, even if it was a voice inside his head. He's talking to himself, so nobody knows the way he was talking to himself. But on the French side, he was like, oh my God, how dare you, And it was worse on the French side because for some reasons, French people are, they think that Beckett is just a French national treasure and they just forget completely about Ireland and the fact that he was Irish. But there is something like that. And Yeats, he wasn't that difficult as a French person, but I wasn't completely at ease. And the first time we went to Sligo and to the Yeats Society, it was a challenge. But it was a tribute. It wasn't like I'm going to tell you who Yeats was. It's just the Yeats that went, that I went through as a reader, and it's my Yeats.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Perhaps,
you.
Julian, we might open it to the floor for questions.
Yeah, and we would really like this to be as conversational as possible. So anyone can please join in, both with questions and responses at this point. If I could start us off, I have a sort of cheeky question to begin with, which is, I think the ghostly voice is the ideal way to bring Yeats back to life right now. A man who spent hours weekly going to seances during his life would appreciate the ghostly aspect of this. And you said you went to Drumcliff. Now, years ago, I remember going to the Yeats Summer School, and there were rumors that people would be meeting up at the grave to do seances. Did you partake of this? Was this how you got Yeats's voice? Was there any occult study going on to bring him back?
Absolutely not. I wish. No, but I kind of noticed or felt that Irish people were not completely comfortable with this mystical aspect of Yeats. Maybe more now, but there was something which was a bit weird about this great poet who was also a politician and so important in history of independence and all that, who had this kind of mystical thoughts, especially in that time, but even for a long time, and at the same time who openly spoke about divorce and was kind of fearless about many subjects at a time where the church was very important. And so I had this feeling that mysticism and was something that I could bring. And why? Not because I had an interest in the believing that it brings, but more because it's very creative in a way, and I think that's the way he used it. I mean, all the visions and the idea. I had something in mind when I was writing this specific book, is that being a radio producer, I always think and write about the sounds. The world is going to me by sounds. It's the way it's musical, and that's the way I work. And because Yeats is a poet of vision, I had to think, this book has to be different because I had to think visually in a way, visually. And he did change a lot the way I was writing this book, because I had this kind of different focus and to create images and to work in this kind of spirit. So I don't think writers has to believe in magic in a way or another, because it's a kind of magic work, no matter how good or bad is the work at the end,
Yeah.
But the process is very mysterious. So it gave a possibility to speak about the man using this aspect of mysticism and this point of view, which I thought, I wish people were not completely comfortable with, and I had, it was easier being French to do that.
But Clíona, can I ask you though? You did translate this into English and to an Irish audience. I mean, what did you do to help capture his voice? What were you reading, listening to?
So I reread the biography, the Foster biography. I read A Vision. I wanted to hear Yeats's voice in prose. And I think that Mayliss was doing a lot of that reading as well in French beforehand, and in English, because...
No, in English, because there's nothing in French. There's no translation of the biographies in French, so I was reading them in English.
And so I think what's important for a translator is to absorb the same sources as the writer, so that you can, I suppose, it's trying to create a similar voice in English. And again, I was very conscious of the fact that Mayliss's French Yeats was for a French audience who knew far less about the great man, whereas an Anglophone audience, be it in Ireland where the book was published or elsewhere, I mean, he is such a vibrant, living presence today. I mean, all Irish people carry Yeats with them in their passports. We have the Lake Isle of Innisfree goes with us on every trip that we take. So he's unavoidable, and I think it was very important for me to feel that I betrayed neither Mayliss and her creative project nor Yeats himself.
Yes, please.
I'd just like to make the point that this is the very last event over Spill in the decade of centenary.
There's a microphone coming to you. Thank you.
I was at the event at the beginning of the week with Roy Foster and Fintan O'Toole, and I always had a little bit of sympathy with Roy Foster having to get deep into sort of seances and so on. But I mean, he made the point that was very fashionable around that time. I mean, remember, there were a couple of women Oxford dons who sort of found themselves literally, so they thought, and they wrote about it, transported back into the Versailles of Marie Antoinette in around 1904. Now, of course, there are some mysteries that people prefer not to have solved. I mean, it would be quite easy, I imagine, to do a DNA on the bones there. But I mean, the French, they are very careful not to do DNA on whether Louis XIV was actually the son of Louis XIII. And of course, Alexandre Dumas wrote whole novels related to that. I suppose the final point I'd like to make is that I think that we tend to underestimate, both in art and literature, the influence and presence of France, which is actually, if you read both politics, whether the Fenians or Parnell and so on, but I mean literary lives. I remember seeing a brilliant exhibition, and a great regret that in Paris, in the Champs-Élysées, Petit Palais, on the last 2 years of Oscar Wilde spent in France. I mean, quite a sad exhibition, but done very, very, very well indeed. And of course, Samuel Beckett, he got the French ambassador to collect his Nobel Prize in Stockholm. I remember, just to finish, somebody sent me after the IRA ceasefire broke down in February 1996. Somebody who was a bit of an opponent of the peace process sent me a card, said, next time, fail better.
Yes, please. And just while we're waiting for the mic to go around, of course, Yeats loved France, right? And France was so important to Yeats. I'll let the theater panel talk about this later, but certainly without his trips to France and his exposure to French theater, I mean, what he did with the Abbey is unthinkable. So you're absolutely right. France is incredibly important to the development of Yeats. Sorry, yes.
My French is limited, but I do note that the French title of your book is Les Amours Dispersés, whereas in English it's Scattered Love, and one is singular and one is plural, clearly. So I'm just wondering about that decision to narrow down, to funnel down. I'm wondering if it's because the French love in the plural and there's some idea that the English or the Irish love in the singular.
I knew you were going to say that. And I think that Yeats's love were quite plural. So I don't know if it's a very French thing on this way. But no, we had discussed that with my publisher. This was a tricky question because I thought we should have it plural. Scattered love, said it was impossible to pronounce. So this was a kind of idea. And they said that the general word would work better. Mm-hmm. Clíona, you would...
I think for me the most interesting thing about the title in French is the fact that the word amour in the singular in French is masculine, but the word amour in the plural in French is feminine.
For some reasons we don't understand.
I think that says a lot about the French language and about French culture, that les amours au pluriel can only be feminine.
And it's funny because it's actually one aspect which interested me in the book is that it would have been very different to write something about Victor Hugo, for example, who lives almost in the same time. I mean, could cross his path at some point, and who had a lot of affairs, and everybody knows, and who was kind of genius master in poetry and literature, but the relationship to women. The way the women he created in his novels and in his poetry are so different than Yeats. I mean, there is something so magical and so much related to the fact that my feeling as a reader was that Maud and Ireland was exactly the same. I mean, there was this kind of incarnation of Ireland in Maud, in her beauty, in her strength, in the way she fought. And then there was something which is almost a confusion, for the reader between Maud Gonne and love and Ireland, and this Celtic word getting back to his feet after this, even the language being colonized by the English. There's something deep that you could feel, and this idea of women, no matter what happened in his personal life, there is something very beautiful and very specific that wouldn't exist in a French culture, and did interest me very much. The way he used love and failed and his experience of sexuality or the loss of sexuality after what he called his second puberty, or no matter how it worked or not, but in poetry, and the way it became an amazing, powerful subject. And we're mentioning Crazy Jane. Crazy Jane is such a powerful character, and I couldn't imagine a French poet at the same time daring to speak about the body and the desire and women in this way. So the question of singular or plural of loves is a very good question at the end.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just about the translation. So I mean, obviously the author has very good English, but you didn't translate it yourself. And it's obviously not word for word translated in English, as you seem to imply that you brought more of an Irish idea of Yeats to the book.
Well, I mean, it is a very faithful translation, but there are moments when there are images, for example, that work in French and images that don't work in English. And you have to make choices on that in that respect. You have to make choices which are idiomatic. And I think it was also a book that you needed a knowledge of Yeats to be able to translate it properly.
There was nothing added, if that's the question. There is nothing transformed or added. The differences were a difference of languages. And to transfer, I mean, to translate expressions, language, and bring the same idea. But there was nothing added in English in the way that new information or changing information.
No, it's not a rewriting, in a sense, if that's the question. It's not a rewriting, but it is a translation which is written in Irish English, as opposed to British English or American English. So it has that nuance to it, I think.
But originally it's written in a French Irish, in Hiberno French. You know, it's a new kind of writing. No, I mean I'm joking, but that's true in a way. I really work having in mind the English language. So I'm joking, but not completely. There's something about sometimes I do translate on purpose the image of an expression in English and turn into French, keeping this idea and this image. And it doesn't exist in French, but everybody would understand. And it brings English in the language. And so even if it's in French, it does change the language, the vision you have of the language. It creates new images. So it's a journey to Ireland in French by the language too, not only by what I tell you about Ireland, or if I tell you the biography or the life of one great man or whatever, but through the language too. So even in the dialogues, I mean, I've been inspired by people I met in Ireland, the specific jokes you'll make in Ireland, and so it's even in the rhythm of the French. Sometimes I do use the punctuation in a way which is not very typical or classical in French, because I like this idea of a kind of good contamination of English in the French language, keeping the French correct, of course, but playing with it in a creative way.
And I think the greatest challenge is Mayliss loves punning in her writing, and perhaps not so much in the Yeats book, but in the Beckett book there were loads of puns, and that was challenging. And sometimes what I do is I'd make a first draft, and I'd have a first go at the pun, and then I'd highlight it in yellow in my text, and I'd come back to it. And translator friends and Mayliss and Pierre, we'd all kind of get our heads around this particular, turn of phrase and how to bring it best to life in English.
For example, for Beckett, we had to, there was few jokes or play on words that we had to translate, and sometimes, like in the book as a character, he's thinking about something and it makes him laugh because he's thinking of a second meaning of this word that could be a bit sexual or something, he has a second idea in his mind, and sometimes you don't have the exact equivalent in English. So you had to find another way to keep this connotation, So sometimes we had to turn a breast into a bomb to make it work, for example.
I love the irony that it took till 2023 for Yeats to finally be able to speak in French. He tried and struggled his whole life to learn the language. So thank you for finally making that happen for him. I'm sure he appreciates it. I think we have time for one more. Anybody like to ask the last question? Yves?
ask about when you were planning the book, whether all the other cases of human remains and questions over bodies that were found that you cover, that Madeleine covers in the story, whether those were something you started out with or if they came up by chance. Because in fact, when the translation of the book came out, it was very timely here because there were many discussions going on in Ireland, as in the rest of Europe, about the repatriation or the restoration of human remains, including the case we've had recently where Trinity College had to restore human remains to the island community in Inishbofin.
Yeah.
So it spoke to a much broader theme, I think, than just the question of who is in Yeats's grave in Drumcliff. And one of the other topics that you mention in passing is the diplomatic discussion, in fact, about whether Joyce's body should have been repatriated after his death. So I just wonder if you started out to write a broader novel about human remains and how we treat them, or if that emerged in the course of writing about Yeats.
I mean, I wouldn't have written anything about Yeats if I didn't have this specific option of starting with the death, because it just made sense. The first novel I read was The End of Life, and I was like, how could I face this question in literature in a way which would bring a bit of light? And I thought that poetry was a good way to bring a bit of light and a distance with this subject. And there is also the question of remain that is very important. You're very right about that. And in my opinion, it's related to the question of religion. I mean, if religion is less, Catholic religion, for example, is less important, then you would pay more attention to the body, the physical body. Whereas you can read that in old articles about this story that everybody knows in Ireland for a long time about Yeats. For a long time it has been, the spirit of, it doesn't matter, the spirit of Yeats is in Ireland. He's there no matter what, he's everywhere, and his poetry is everywhere. And you can feel that this material question became more and more important for everybody. And I think it's very much related to what we do with the metaphysical question now, and this was something very interesting, because if you look at traditions about what you do with the bodies, it gives you a lot of information about the way you deal with the past, for example. And in the Irish point of view, everything I read about the story of the body of Yeats, there was something missing about the experience of war. He died in 1939. And in France, when he mentioned war, this is such a deep question in France. The question of the body becomes something really not important in that time, because there was so much happening, So this is a very huge difference of approach. So this was very interesting in my point of view to understand the history of France and Ireland in those times. And I think that France, no matter if people like Maud Gonne was back and forth in the two countries, and Sean McBride had a huge importance and had a strong French accent, had a French education, and there was a lot of literary links also, but there is big cultural gap between the two countries too, and the history was very different. I was so surprised to find that Maud had this relationship with Millevoye in French. She was, you have no idea how much it's weird to understand that it's such a different word, and how she could mix. And it took me a while to understand this strange relationship between its two political words, which are so different and belongs to very different words. And so the question of the body is universal. It's also a very important question about where is the truth. you were very right to mention the King Louis XIV and all that. I mean, is it the truth to know where the body and whose body is it? I mean, to be really honest, in a coffin like that, you probably had some part of the body which belongs to him, some to other people, and who knows? And when I was starting to investigate and ask people who work in cemeteries, and everything they were telling me, the guy in Roquebrune Cap Martin, who's such a wonderful man working there, and he told me so much detail and said, oh, but when we put remains, we never put all the body. He said, remains means just one bit of the body. I said, nobody knows that. I mean, everybody thinks it's the body, you know? So everything we think or fantasize about that is completely true. It's completely wrong. And so it's very interesting to think that people who work with bodies as an everyday job, and people who bury and who they would tell you stories, and it's like nobody know the way it works, what we do with the remains. So this was very interesting in a way to understand that if you start to write about this question of death, even physically thinking, okay, is he here, is he there, does he belong to this world? And you look at a thumb and you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to contain the whole humanity at the end. And this is just such a vertigo, to face this question. This is so that you really need to find another way to use, to understand this by, poetry is a way to be able to talk about death. And I was thinking about, the Irishman forces his death and the way he could face this question himself. And it was so deep and so powerful in a few words, saying that, So that's an endless question.
And it's amazing to think he's a man who spent his life trying to escape the body, right? He's trying to escape the material. He literally had an astral marriage, right? Like he was more concerned with the immaterial than the material, and yet that's sort of what we have left, and that's what we grapple with as people who live on afterwards. So.
And that's where he is today. That was our thought at the very beginning of the book. It's like, oh my God, he has an end that suits him. Like Beckett ends the way, he wrote all his life about what it is to be an old man and waiting for the end, and he just ended in this nursing home, which is exactly like a kind of caricature of what happened on stage, And it's the same for Yeats. Like, where is he? Who knows? Somewhere among the clouds above. There's something which suits him in a very ironic way.
I agree. Well, Mayliss, Clíona, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian.
We will now take a break in the card room, which I'm hoping either Porg or Pauline can show us the way to.